All right. We spend a lot of time on this channel talking about what is by far the number one thing that married couples want to talk to us about, which is
Sex?
sex. That's right. And I joke about it on this channel a lot, not joking about sex, but just, joking about sexual relationships because it adds some levity to it and it's something that I think is really relatable. But I'm not making any jokes this time because we're going to take a serious look at a passage of scripture that deals with the sexual relationship, and it's Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians 7. But I want to talk about it in light of this intimacy table idea that we set out for the last 4 weeks. If you didn't have a chance to listen to it, I'd really encourage you to go back and do that. But one of the 4 pillars of the intimacy table is sexual intimacy. And the point we made last week is that having sex is not the same as sexual intimacy.
Right.
So how do we have true sexual intimacy? And praise the Lord that he didn't leave us wondering that, but he gave his words to Paul, and Paul shared them with us in a couple of places that I want to tie together today in the hopes that you can have deeper sexual intimacy in your marriage.
Let's get into that.
Before we get into today's episode, just wanted to remind you that in the description of the video below, we put links to all of our social media accounts.
You can always reach us with questions or comments about this episode at marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com.
And finally, if you want to support us financially, there is a link to be able to do so at the end of each of the descriptions of our videos. Now, let's get back to the show. Hey everybody, I'm Nathan Warnock.
I'm Andrea Warnock, and you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. This is a time that we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about that, and how we live that out practically.
That's right. So I kind of spoiled the lead in the open, but we're going to be talking a bit today about a couple places of what the Bible has to say about sex. And the Bible talks about sex quite a bit, actually, within the context of marriage, which, as the Bible makes clear, is the only rightful place for sex within a relationship. And so the really interesting thing about the intimacy table that we talked about the last 4 weeks, which is this idea that our marriages are based on 4 pillars of intimacy, like the 4 legs of a 4-legged dining room table. And those pillars are emotional intimacy, non-sexual physical intimacy, spiritual intimacy, and sexual intimacy. And we talked about sexual intimacy last week generally, but I wanted to dig into that a little bit deeper because this is, by and away, the biggest thing that couples bring up when we talk to them, particularly couples that are either newly married or maybe have some issues going on in their marriage. It so often revolves around the issue of sex. And that makes perfect sense because other than arguably spiritual intimacy, there's no more private thing you can share with another person than the sexual aspect of your body. And so it's understandable that this sexual relationship, when done incorrectly or done in a way that is perceived incorrectly, can do real damage in a relationship. Not to mention, we live in a hypersexualized society that seems to prey on the innocence of particularly young women. And so you end up with a lot of individuals in marriage who frankly either have actually been or feel sexually manipulated or abused or just objectified before they even get into marriage.
Sure.
So what I want to do today is take a look at a couple of places in the Bible where Paul specifically considers the idea of marriage, but specifically the idea of sex. But the first thing I want to do is set this all up with a thing that Paul says in Ephesians, and it's in Ephesians 5. And in this section of Ephesians 5, Paul is actually just talking about marriage in general, but he says something about husbands that I want us to keep in mind as we go back and look at what he says about sex. And here's what it is. It's in Ephesians 5, and I'm just going to start in verse 25. Now, today is not going to be all about how husbands ought to be handling the sexual aspect of marriage. This is going to be about how couples should handle the idea of delving into greater sexual intimacy within marriage. And wives, we're going to put the heat on you a little bit too. But the point is Paul is an equal opportunity offender with regards to the idea of sex, and he's going to basically call men and women to looking at sex the same way. But because men and women are different, it plays out differently with regards to how men think about this and how women think about this. But here's what I want to share with you. Now, I want you to listen specifically to what husbands are called to do and why, because the husband in marriage is a picture of Christ and his leadership of the church. So it says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ did the church, because we are members of his body." So what Paul's reminding husbands there is your role is to love your wife as if your wife was you, because you care for your bodies. And certainly the church in Ephesus, a heavily military area, would have understood what it looked like for a man to care for his body, because there were these centurions who had grown their body and beat their body into submission all around them. They would have understood, man, these guys care for their bodies. Do I care for my wife like I care for my own body?
Not by beating them into submission, though.
Right. Yes.
Clear.
Nice. Thank you. Yes. No, this is not about that. So
I just thought it was funny that you use that term.
So then what's going to happen here is Paul, in a different letter to the church in Corinth, is going to talk now specifically about the sexual relationship. And it's in 1 Corinthians 7, and that's where we're going to sort of read to set out this conversation. But as you're considering this topic, I just want you to ask yourself this one question. When you think about the sexual intimacy in your marriage, and you think about how that sexual intimacy could be deeper, does your thought involve something that is a right of yours or a responsibility of yours? And here's what I mean by that. When I ask you that question, what could be done to make your sexual relationship more intimate in your marriage? Do you respond with, well, if she would just do this more often, or if she would just try that thing I've wanted her to try, or if she would just do what I've asked her to do? Or does it revolve around, man, I need to ask her what I could do to pursue her better in the area of sex? Man, I wonder if I could do something different. Maybe my go-to moves aren't as great as I think they are. Maybe there's something that I could do to pursue her body in a way that's more pleasing to her. You see, there's a clear difference there. And one of them is self-serving. It's the way society, the secular world around us, says we ought to be thinking about sex. And one is spouse-serving, which, as we're going to see, is the way Paul, under the influence of the Holy Spirit, calls us to take a look at sex. So again, we're going to flip over to 1 Corinthians 7 and see what Paul has to say about sex. So he's responding in the beginning of 7 to a letter that he received from the church in Corinth, a letter that we don't have recorded in the Bible, but the letter, at least a question in the letter, was about sex. And the question seems to be, because in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So it seems pretty clear that someone had said, hey, Jesus has been raptured. right? Paul, you've started this gospel community here in Corinth, and you've told us that the day of the Lord is coming. And so wouldn't it be better for us to not be having sex and, pursuing those kinds of relationships and just spending our time worshiping the Lord? Mm-hmm. And on the whole of this 1 through 16, Paul's going to say, yeah, that would be better. I would ask you to live as I live. Why? Because it opens me up to
as a single
really serve
person.
the Lord. That's right.
Right.
But Paul's going to recognize something about what it means to be human. And what it means to be human is hormones and eyes that see things we likey from time to time. And the reality of an emotional human being who meets a human being of the opposite sex and goes, oh man, I feel like I'm falling for you. And now I don't know what to do about this because I want to be with you in intimacy, emotionally and sexually and otherwise. But Paul's saying it'd be better for me to not. And what do I do?
And I'm sure there had to be a recognition too of just as there are different parts of the body, that serve different purposes.
Sure.
There are also people with lives that serve different purposes for the kingdom, So
yeah.
If everybody were single, obviously then there'd be no godly procreation.
Yeah, the human race wouldn't last very long. Jesus would need to come back right away.
Right. But there's also ministry that happens by married people or families or whatever that would not happen from single people. So it's also, I'm sure, a recognition of, well, we can't be all the same. We're not all called to be the same. We need to serve different needs. We need to be different people.
Sure.
And God has made us differently, and then we need to pursue those things that the Lord has called us to.
That's right. And Paul's going to recognize that right in verse 2 after he repeats that question. He says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Great, right? That makes us feel good. Nothing's uncomfortable about that. Well, Paul doesn't stop there. Here's what he says in verses 3 and 4, and this is going to be the meat of what we're going to talk about today. Verse 3 says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and therefore and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does.
Sounds like a duck.
Right. Yeah, that's a much oft wrongfully quoted and or misogynistically used and or completely skipped over couple of verses because those are difficult verses to think about.
Really hard.
What does that mean for our marriage? Because it's really easy on the surface to read that and go, well, this is really fantastic for me, person in my marriage who wants to have a lot of sex or more sex than the other person. And I say that specifically because we've known a number of couples where that was the woman was the one who had the higher sex drive than the man, even though maybe that's not the stereotypical case. It certainly can be the case. The point is, if you're the person that has the higher sex drive, it's really tempting, isn't it, to go, hey, Andrea, did you see this? Did you read this? Did you read this part here? Right? And use that as a bludgeoning tool to try and manipulate your spouse into doing what you want them to do sexually. And I would just say, just real specifically up front, this is in the Bible, so we can't skip over it, right? I mean, we can't go, that probably in the Greek that probably meant something completely different, and then just move on, right? I mean, the reality of the matter is, if we're honest about the intimacy table, and we're honestly saying, I want physical intimacy, non-sexual physical intimacy, emotional, spiritual, and sexual intimacy, and we're honestly saying we believe the Bible has the answer to how to have intimacy in these four areas, which I believe it does, we can't afford to skip over a verse like this where Paul's saying this is how a husband and wife are meant to relate to each other. That being said, those verses deserve a bit of a deeper look than to just read them and hurl them like some sort of weapon across the room at your spouse.
Yeah. And that's not ever honoring to scripture to use it as a manipulating tool or hurling it at somebody. You know, we don't ever see the Lord, we don't ever see Jesus in his ministry using the scripture as manipulation, right?
Right.
Certainly we use him seeing that to speak truth to people and call people out and all of that, but it's never manipulating somebody else.
Right. You know, I will say we need to be a little careful with these verses because I think sometimes, and yes, obviously if you're, you know, if you're that guy or girl that like reads this verse and then goes, all right, let's close this up and head to the bedroom, then, you know, that's just being a jerk, right? Number one rule of life, don't be a jerk. But I'm talking about just because these verses also are convicting verses, right? I mean, they just are.
Right.
So,
and it's also, it's also not fair to say just because I'm feeling convicted that's manipulation.
That's right.
That could be just conviction, you know?
Right.
So we have to be careful of that.
That's right. So I want to read these two verses in the King James Version because I find them interesting in that version. So here's what it says for verse 3. Let the husband render unto his wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto her husband. For the wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power over his own body, but the wife.
So in that verse 3, the King James says, render unto the wife due benevolence. What does it say in ESV? Her conjugal rights.
Conjugal rights.
Right?
Which
that seems different.
Yeah, which is really interesting because if you look at the Greek word that is used there is eunoia. Mm-hmm. Eunoia. And that word eunoia, it means... Yeah,
eunoia me too.
Okay.
That's a funny one.
It means goodwill or benevolence, or euphemistically conjugal rights or sex.
Yep.
So it's really interesting that Paul chooses that, and clearly Paul's having a conversation about sex here. I mean, he was addressing a sexual question from the church in Corinth.
The whole section we're in is about sex.
That's right. But I find it interesting that he uses a term that the primary definition is not sex. It's more of a euphemistic, right? It's like when we say, hey, babe, you want to go upstairs and get it on, right? Like, we're not saying like, hey, do you want to go upstairs and lay on top of each other or, you know, put our clothes on top of ourselves, right? Like, that's a euphemism that in modern parlance, we understand what it means.
Sure.
So in a sense, not in a sense, Paul's using a word here that has two meanings. And I find that really interesting.
Right. So I would say it's because it probably means both things, right? Render unto the wife her, what does it say? Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence or her conjugal rights.
Right.
So it's both. It's both and, right? We're not, hey, I'm just having sex with you. This is your right, my right. We're just having sex. There's a kindness, there's some other words that this means, but
goodwill.
A goodwill. There's the love part of the sexual relationship that men should be giving their wives and wives should be giving their men. There's the intimacy part of that relationship that's necessary. That's so important that we should be giving each other. It's not just the act. It's the intimacy behind the act.
Right. So then when you move into verse 4, thinking about benevolence and conjugal rights together in this one word, then we move into verse 4 and it says starts with the word for. So we're saying, hey, husbands, you've got to give your wife her benevolent conjugal rights, benevolence, conjugal, goodwill rights. Wives, you've got to give your husband their benevolence, goodwill, conjugal rights. And then he says because The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Paul's recognizing a couple of things here. In modern Christian marriages, we have fallen into this trap that we want to be one when we want to be one, and I want to be two when I want to be two. And it's not God honoring, because in going all the way back to the garden, Genesis 2, God says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Jesus adds on to that in Matthew. Do you remember what he says? For what God has brought together,
Let no man put asunder.
Yeah.
Or
separate. Yeah, that means you too. Like, that's partly what Paul's saying here is, wives, you don't own your body, your husband does, because you're one. So you can't go, well, I'm one, but except when he wants to do something I don't want to do, then we're two. And the same thing with regards to husbands. And husbands, I'm going to start with you, and Andrew, then I'll let you kind of share what you want to share, because I know you've really wrestled through thinking about how to talk about this, because it can be tricky to talk about, particularly to wives. But husbands, I want to be really clear when I say this. There's more to what Paul's saying here than sex. The rights that your wife is owed can't really be understood if we don't tie into that an understanding of Ephesians 5, where Paul says, husbands, care for your wives as if your own body, because what husband doesn't care for his own body, right? Christ, you are a picture of Christ's desired relationship with the church. Christ's entire mission wasn't thinking about Christ. He was thinking about his people. His entire ministry was about others around him. Then we take a look at what it says in 1 Peter 3, I think it's 6. Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, with goodwill. Right? Peter's saying the same thing Paul's saying here. Husbands, we owe a right to our wives. What's that right? Goodwill, benevolence, and conjugal rights. In what context? Well, in the context of your wife's body is your own. You see, we read that and we go, oh yeah, my wife's body is mine, so I can do with it as I want. That's a misunderstanding of what I believe is being said here. There's a responsibility to your wife's body being yours. That means you have a responsibility to figure out how your wife's body works. And I'm not just talking about in a sexual manner. I'm talking about, do you ever spend time thinking about, well, how does a woman's body just work generally? Like, why is it that my wife just seems annoyed when I don't say anything sexual all day, and then we get into bed at 10:30 at night and I roll over and go, hey babe, want a little bit of this? And she doesn't react well. Like, we immediately go to, man, my wife's just a jerk. I better shoot her a quick text about 1 Corinthians 7. Right? Instead of going, hey, you know what? Maybe women's bodies don't work that way. And I don't care that your brother's girlfriend's body works that way. Right? Because you didn't marry your brother's girlfriend. You married your wife. So you have a responsibility to live with your wife in an understanding way and understand, hey, my wife's body is mine. And when I get to heaven on the other side, I don't want God to go, man, you took really crappy care of this wife's body that I gave you. Right? Did you spend the time going, man, the fact that my wife's body is mine, that's a responsibility, a big responsibility. So when I think about sexual intimacy, I best not be thinking about how to get mine. I best be thinking about how can I really pursue her body as if it were my own? How can I understand her body better as if it were my own? And yes, that has huge implications outside of the bedroom. Also has big implications inside of the bedroom. Just being super transparent, guys, we get a lot of communication from women that guys in general suck in the bedroom because we're not always very good at recognizing, hey, guys' bodies and girls' bodies are made differently. And as guys, if we're not really careful, it really easily becomes it was good for me. Was it good for you? I wasn't really listening. Right. And we don't pursue our wives as if they were our own body. Because I'll bet, guys, if you were struggling with an issue where you weren't having an orgasm time after time after time, or some other physical thing was going on with your body, you'd figure it out. Are you putting that same level of effort into your wife? It's not about your rights. It's about your responsibility. And that's what Paul's saying here in this passage with regards to husbands. So, babe, I know you've wrestled with this a lot, and you shared with me what you wanted to share, and I think it's really good and really important, but can be challenging. So I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, we've talked about sex before on this channel, of course, and some people have told us we're just not very clear on these verses. Like, we kind of seem to be a little bit wishy-washy in order to
not want to say it like it is.
Right. And I'll tell you, it's not because we're trying to please certain side, like both sides, or not be totally clear. It's because this is hard. And because there's so many caveats to, I'll talk as a wife. As a wife, you give the authority of your body over to your husband. But it's also there's also like, yeah, but not if there's abuse going on. You don't just say, hey, this is okay, and I'm going to submit to that. So in the world that we live in, we're such a consumer society, right? Like in so many areas, but especially sexually. And we see that in Hollywood. We hear about that in relationships. We see that in crazy headlines. You see it everywhere that the sexual relationships people are having are a lot about consumerism. And that's not what this is about at all. So when we're talking about these verses, it's hard because this is countercultural, and our culture thinks about things through a filter of consumerism.
That's right.
And so when you're talking about giving the authority of your body over to your husband and vice versa, that's a hard pill to swallow when you live in a consumer society, and even the Christian church largely are consumers when it comes to sexual relationship. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And so when we're talking about this, it's hard to be clear when it's like, yeah, but so many sexual relationships are doing it wrong. And it's just a hard thing to say, yeah, but you still need to give the authority of your body over to your husband. So the reality is that there as husbands and wives, we need to be always thinking about being self-sacrificial and serving our spouse. And that includes in all areas of marriage and intimacy and sex. And so if we're doing that, then this works out, right? This works out great. And if we're not, this is a difficult thing. But I'll talk to the wives. You will change your husband if you choose to give the authority of your body over to your husband. Yep. And again, sexual abuse, coercion, all that is manipulation. All that is not okay. But I'm talking in a way that's not going on. Okay.
Yeah, and honestly, whether that's honestly going on, because there is some of that too that is like, oh man, I really know starting at lunch he sent me a message about thinking about you in the shower, and that feels like manipulation to me.
It's not.
Right. Like,
okay.
We have to be honest about what's manipulation and what's abuse as well.
Right.
And I'm not belittling that at all. We've been very clear on this channel about abuse, but I also want to be honest about the other thing too.
Right. So if I'm going to be honest with you, ladies and men, these passages are a great, huge sign, like bright neon sign as to why it's so important that we're careful about who we marry.
That's exactly right.
Because you are supposed to give the authority of your body sexually, which is an incredibly intimate thing, over to your spouse.
Right.
And for women, we're also supposed to submit to our husbands. And there's no like submit only if he's a good leader kind of a thing.
Right.
We're supposed to submit. Our choice in who we marry is so vitally important,
Right.
because if we're choosing to marry somebody who's going to treat our bodies as if it's his own, and who's going to give us authority over his body and take care of the authority that he has over our body, then that's the way that's a beautiful thing. But if that's going to happen with a spouse who's not doing that right, it's a hurtful thing.
That's
you know,
right.
and so we have to be super careful with that. I think those were my biggest things about those verses.
Yeah. So how does this matter? We'll bring this in for a landing. How does this help you grow in intimacy? And I would just tell you, when it comes to sex, the answer to that second question I asked you back at the beginning of this episode about when you think about sex, are you thinking about you, or are you thinking about your partner, your husband or wife? The answer to that question is the key to growing in sexual intimacy in marriage. Because all these caveats that make it difficult to talk about this, abuse, manipulation, on and on and on and on and on and on and on, don't become a thing if both people in the marriage are
right.
thinking of the other first with regards to sex. And yet, because sex has become such a consumer commodity here in this country, it is really hard to wrap your head around just thinking about your spouse. Mm-hmm. And it takes training. And that's where, when we talk about the intimacy table, all these things are simple things to say out loud, but they're really difficult things to put into practice, because particularly with regards to sex, a lot of it is us having to retrain our brains to think about someone else instead of either spreading my wild oats with my spouse all the time, or putting up all of these defenses towards my spouse because it's uncomfortable for me to give myself away sexually.
It's allowing the Lord to refine you.
That's right.
So that you have a better understanding of the Lord, so that you have a better relationship with your spouse. Our marriages are not supposed to be best at our wedding day, and then we just glide from there.
That's right.
The Lord has so much more for us to learn. And these passages are a great example of, man, this is hard and this is uncomfortable, but it's true because it's in the Word, and it's something that God has called us to. And so he wants to refine us in those areas and work out our salvation in these sorts of verses.
Right. That's right. Man, I hope that gives you something to think about and to talk about with regards to the sexual intimacy in your marriage. We wanted to camp out on sexual intimacy a little bit because it's such a huge thing that Satan uses to just wreck married couples. If you struggle in this area and you need help, I would ask you to just reach out to us, please, marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on the video or pop over to our Facebook page and leave a comment there. We'll respond to all of those comments, and even if it's just offering you some guidance or some prayer, we'd love to help you out with that. We are going to be stepping away from talking about sex for the next several weeks and do some, we got a top 5 coming up and some other practical marriage discussions, which I'm really looking forward to having. But
man, we haven't done a top 5 in a long time.
I know, and I think I have a couple ideas for some fun ones. So look forward to that. But until then, please know we're here for you. If you have questions in this area or dealing with issues in this area, please reach out. If you're dealing with abuse in this area, you need to get others outside involved, those from your church. Depending on the situation, you may need to get the police involved, but please do that. The Lord is clear in the Bible. He does not ever ask us to put ourselves and keep ourselves in an abusive relationship. So there may need to be a time of separation while your spouse gets their issues fixed or the law gets involved, and we'll continue to pray over your spouse, and hopefully there can be restoration in your marriage once they get that. ironed out. So feel free to reach out. Otherwise, guys, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. And remember, no matter how difficult these things are, no matter what position your marriage is in currently, how bad it's been, how close to divorce you are even right now, God is for your marriage. Have a great week.